Good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Edward H. Nabb Research Center gallery this evening to what I think is going to be a very interesting and provocative talk. Before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to let you know also that this presentation is the fourth of a series that's being made available through Delmarva Discussions, fifth. Dr. Clara Small, a year or so ago, created a grant from which she sought money from the President's Office and the Fulton School for these Delmarva discussions, and this is the last of the presentations that we have planned for that. So I usually talk a little bit about the Nabb Center and what the Nabb Center does before we let our speakers talk, but I'm going to cut right to the chase tonight because I promised our speaker that he'd have an hour in which to talk to us and tell us everything there is to know about Delaware in the Civil War. So let me introduce him, tell you a little bit about him. Stan Williams retired in 2010 after nearly 35 years of government service with NASA, conducting safety and mission assurance. And I'm not sure what that means, so maybe he'll tell me afterwards. He has pursued a lifelong interest in studying and researching American Civil War history and is recognized as a significant scholar of Delaware history as well. Mr. Williams also owns a fascinating collection of Civil War artifacts, historical documents, and rare books which assist him in expanding his research efforts. He has conducted extensive research focused on the preservation of historical sites, as well as in-depth family research in support of a number of heritage associations. Mr. Williams is a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, a member of the Stuart Mosby Historical Society, the Lewis Historical Society, and he has served for many years as a member of the Gettysburg Battlefield Guides, conducting tours to particular battle sites. Stan is also a friend of the John Dickinson Plantation and, of course, is a frequent contributor both in writing historical articles and in making community presentations for the Nabb Center. He has shared with us a number of presentations in the past, including Part 1 of Delaware in the Civil War. Tonight is Part 2. Many of us here at the Nabb Center and in the broader community have gained much insight and developed a deepened interest in history thanks to the enthusiasm and dedication of Stan Williams. His expertise is undeniable in his field, and we're very fortunate and excited to have him with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Stan Williams.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. In May 1864, the 4th Delaware Infantry Regiment leaves the defenses of Washington, D.C. and joins the Union Army of the Potomac in an advance on the Confederate capital at Richmond that will culminate with the surrender of General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. In a letter dated May 22nd, 1864, Captain Thomas H. Reynolds, serving in the Union 5th Corps, 4th Division, 2nd Brigade of the 4th Delaware Infantry Regiment, writes the following lines to his sister Frances, living in Camden, Delaware. I came from Alexandria on yesterday, saw the 3rd Delaware and 1st Delaware Cavalry there. They were on their way to the front. The boys seemed in very good spirits and will no doubt see the fury before many days. We are still in the front of the defenses of Washington with no enemy except Colonel Mosby and his lawless band, and even they do not trouble us much. Captain Reynolds goes on to write, if I go, do not be alarmed, for you must remember that I take my chances with at least 200,000 of as brave men as ever graced the pages of history. In less than a month, on June the 18th, Captain Thomas H. Reynolds was mortally wounded while engaged with Confederates on the outskirts of Richmond, the assault on Petersburg. He dies 2 days later at the age of only 23. He is buried at the Barrett's Chapel Cemetery, located near Frederica in Kent County, Delaware. Joe Robinson, one of our company, a brave young Delawarean at Dempsey Walker, crawled upon their all fours to within 200 yards of the Yankee pickets, and laying down behind Little Corn Hills, began to interfere with our friends across the way to a considerable extent. Robert Campbell, 5th Texas Regiment, Company A. Joel Robinson, described in Campbell's battlefield account, was actually George Julian Robinson, a native of Sussex County, Georgetown, who, on October 24, 1861, went south to Richmond, cast his lot with the Confederacy, joining what would become known as John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade, 5th Texas Regiment. Although Robinson was slightly wounded at the Battle of Gaines' Mill on June 27, 1862, the third battle of what was considered the 7 days battles on the Peninsula Campaign, he would recover from those wounds to participate in some of the fiercest fighting of the American Civil War, the Battle of Second Manassas, Antietam, Gettysburg, and he served with Hood's Texans in the West at Chickamauga, Georgia, and the siege on Knoxville, November 29, 1863. His luck would run out, though, at the Widow Tapp's farm when a bullet shatters his jaw and nearly severs his tongue. After the war, he goes south. He goes to Texas, but he'll return to his native state of Delaware in the 1880s. His death certificate records the date of his passing is May the 7th, 1897, and he is buried in the historic St. George's Episcopal Church Cemetery, located near Harbison in Sussex County, Delaware. Two of Delaware's native sons, one bearing allegiance to a nation, the other allegiance to the South's cause for Southern independence. As Dr. Harold Bell Hancock described in his book, Delaware during the Civil War, as a border state, Delaware paid homage to both sections, but gave complete allegiance to neither. In tonight's lecture, we'll discuss just a few of these characters and events that participated in this monumental struggle, a conflict that, beyond question, would reshape the destiny of this nation, but indeed, it would also leave an indelible mark on the political and the social life in Delaware that in many ways still exists today. Next slide, please. After decades of political conflict and sectional tension, based largely in and around many of those issues and events we discussed in our lecture back in March, if any of you attended, the questions over tariff legislation, the spread of slavery into the new territories, the Great Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the violence that would follow along the Missouri and Kansas border, the Dred Scott decision of 1857, John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, October 16, 1859, and with the election of the first Republican Party candidate, now it's Republican with a capital R, Abraham Lincoln. 7 southern states secede from the Union. The first one to go, South Carolina, on December 20th, 1860. The following month, 5 more southern states leave the Union. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas goes out February 23rd. South Carolina now considers itself a sovereign state, exclusive of any control by the federal government whatsoever. But there's a problem, because garrison at Charleston are 80-some odd federal troops commanded by a federal officer named Major Robert Anderson. Under the cover of darkness, just 6 days after secession, December 26, Major Anderson moves his small garrison from Fort Moultrie in Charleston, that's now susceptible to attack by secessionist land forces, to Fort Sumter, located on a man-made granite island near the mouth of Charleston Harbor. On April the 11th, now commanding several large seacoast guns at Charleston, General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard issues a demand to Major Anderson to surrender Fort Sumter and surrender his garrison. Well, the Lincoln administration had put this off just about as long as they could, and Major Anderson refuses Beauregard's demand. Incidentally, I would like to mention the irony of this situation. Beauregard, who's commanding the seacoast guns aimed at Fort Sumter, was formerly an artillery student of Major Anderson's while the two were at the West Point Military Academy together. But as you can well imagine, they were not friends now. At approximately 4:30 the following morning, April 12th, the Confederates fire the first round from the Fort Johnson batteries. It's a 10-inch mortar round and explodes approximately 100 feet above the walls of Fort Sumter. Observing this out at sea, approximately 3 miles from downtown Charleston, is a naval officer. His name is Gustavus Fox. He's standing on the deck of his flagship, the USS Baltic, waiting for a relief expedition to arrive to come to the aid of Major Anderson and the Fort Sumter garrison. The relief expedition consists of 3 ships: the USS Pawnee, the USS Paul Hatton, and the USS Pocahontas. The USS Paul Hatton will never arrive. It had been diverted to Fort Pickens, a fort on the Florida coast that was going to be under attack very soon by secessionist forces. Commanding the USS Pocahontas, John P. Gillis, naval officer from Wilmington, Delaware. He arrives the following day on April 13th, and he's there near the fort. He arrives on the 13th. He's there on the 14th to observe the surrender of Major Robert Anderson and the Fort Sumter garrison. He records in his journal at that time, "The little band of patriots had saluted their old flag by firing 50 guns and marched out with their tattered ensign to the tune of our own Yankee Doodle." Gillis will go on to attain the rank of Commodore in the United States Navy. He'll see action off the coast of North Carolina, Cape Hatteras, and he's credited with capturing several blockade runners just outside of Mobile Bay, Alabama. Living up in Wilmington, Delaware about this time is a lady who during the course of the American Civil War kept an extraordinary diary. It is considered by many historians to be the most complete and accurate diary of any Delaware civilian during this time. Her name was Anna M. Ferris. Anna M. Ferris records the following in her diary. Tidings today, though not entirely reliable or sufficiently so as to confirm the disastrous reports of yesterday. Major Anderson surrendered the fort before the ships could come to his relief, and the Confederate flag floats in place of the national emblem. The President this morning issued a proclamation calling out the militia of the states to the amount 75,000, and we are now in midst of revolution and civil war. The feeling of shame, indignation, and dread is indescribable. Anna M. Ferris, April 15th, 1861. With Lincoln's call upon the states that were considered not in rebellion to the United States government for 75,000 volunteers for a period of 90 days, 4 more southern states secede from the Union. The next one to go is that key state of Virginia on April 17th. 1861, followed by Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee goes out June the 8th. Next slide, please. In April 1861, Dr. William Burton of Milford, Democrat, is serving as the state's governor. He had just barely won the 1858 election over his Union/Republican opponent, James Buckmaster, who was a merchant out of Frederica. And Dr. Burton will serve as governor of the state until January of 1863. And it's at that time that William Cannon, a member of the Union Party, is elected as governor. And he will serve as governor until March of 1865 when he dies in office. The Delaware State Legislature will appoint Gove Salisbury, that's capital S-A-U-L-S, B-U-R-Y, to finish Cannon's term, and Salisbury will actually be a one-term governor himself, finishing his term in 1871. With the firing on Fort Sumter and the attack on the 6th Massachusetts Infantry by a mob of secessionists as they marched through the streets of Baltimore on their way to the defenses of Washington, D.C. on April 19th, 1861, and with the First Battle of Manassas on July 21st, we're beginning to see among some Delawareans those that support the South's right to secede from the Union and those that don't. In July 1861, a young schoolmaster in Kent County writes to his sweetheart about the political situation in Camden, Delaware. Lou, there is a great deal of excitement here at this time. People are almost forgetting their former relations and are heard to use threats towards their former friendships, which almost causes one to think he is not in a civilized but barbarous community. In Seaford, Delaware, former governor William Harrison Ross is now a secessionist. He was quoted as saying, "I will die 1,000 deaths rather than make war upon our brethren in Virginia." When his son, Caleb Ross, goes south to join up with the Confederacy, the 9th Virginia Cavalry first known as Virginia Rifles, former Governor William Harrison Ross leaves the country, goes to Europe, England, makes an attempt to return the year 1863, but most probably with the threat of being arrested for treason or maybe even possibly executed for treason, he remains in Europe until after the war. When the war is over, the Ross family from Seaford sends a personal representative south to recover the remains of their son, Caleb Ross, who died in Confederate service from typhoid fever on September 17, 1861. When the casket arrives, according to one account, there was a small fern, almost a twig, sitting on the casket lid. And at some time during the burial, the fern was planted next to the gravesite of Caleb Ross. Today, that fern is 25 to 35 feet high and stands as a living witness to the sadness and the sorrow of the Ross family during the American Civil War. On May the 11th, 1861, our governor, Democrat, Governor William Burton, appoints Henry A. Dupont, West Point graduate, class of 1833, now president of the Dupont Company, as Major General of the Delaware State Militia. It will later evolve into the Delaware National Guard. Well, Mr. Dupont is certainly worried about these successionist militia companies that have been forming within the state. After all, he has a gunpowder plant up here on the Brandywine. So he issues a mandate that they lay down their arms and take an oath of allegiance to the United States. But our governor, Democrat Dr. William Burton, rescinds that order because he's trying to steer a political course right down the center of the two opposing parties. You can imagine what an outroar this was. As a matter of fact, Governor Burton was called a secessionist by many prominent Delawareans at the time. Another Delawarean and Dupont that's certainly worth mentioning was Samuel Francis Dupont, who on November 7, 1861, successfully led a flotilla of United States naval ships aboard his flagship, the USS Wabash, in the bombardment and capture of Port Royal Sound, South Carolina. But as a rear admiral, he was unsuccessful, leading a flotilla of 9 iron ships, called ironclads at the time, in the capture of Charleston Harbor. Thus, he fell out of grace with his boss, then Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. It was only after another naval attack by federal forces fails that Samuel Francis Dupont is able to vindicate his credibility as a naval officer. And actually, Charleston was never taken by naval forces. They surrendered to William Tecumseh Sherman's land forces February 18, 1865. When the Lincoln administration called upon the states to fill a quota of 75,000 volunteers for a period of 90 days, Delaware was expected to provide 780 of those. Well, Dr. William Burton, now governor of the state, questioned the Lincoln administration whether he or the administration had the constitutional authority to mandate the recruitment of federal troops. You have to remember, this was certainly a period of states' rights, even in these border states. Well, despite this, and some peace demonstrations that were held within the state, there was a large demonstration held in Dover in June of 1861. Delaware would begin recruiting soldiers and sailors for Lincoln's Army and Navy. By December 1861, then Secretary of War Simon Cameron praised Delaware as having the good sense and patriotism of the people who had triumphed over traitors. Well, it appears that Simon Cameron was far more impressed with the state of Delaware than the Lincoln administration was impressed with Simon Cameron. Cameron's whole office was coveted with scandal, corruption, shoddy dealings with federal contractors, and he resigns on January the 11th, 1862. It's at that time the Lincoln administration appoints Edwin M. Stanton as Secretary of War, and he will serve as Secretary of War and throughout the Lincoln administration. Delaware would provide 9 infantry regiments for Lincoln's Army, a cavalry battalion, 2 field artillery batteries, a heavy artillery battery, and 2 independent companies. 2 independent companies, Milligan's Independent Cavalry, and the other was Neal's Light Field Artillery. And I would like to mention that Neal's Light Field Artillery would leave the Eastern Theater of Operations in February of 1864 and go south to Louisiana and serve with the Union 19th Corps in what was called the Red River Campaign. It was a series of battles along the Red River in Louisiana that began March the 10th until May 22nd, 1864. There were approximately 300 free men of color and an untold number of whites who would serve in the Union Navy. As in units in the North and the South, most casualties resulted from disease. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Delaware Infantry Regiments would see extensive service in the Eastern Theater of Operations, to include the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. The formal surrender was signed on April 12th. There were at least 9, 8 in the Federal Army, 1 in the Federal Navy, who will win the Congressional Medal of Honor for courage and valor. One of these we're going to talk about tonight. His name was James Park Hostels. But I think this would be the appropriate time to mention that you may hear his surname pronounced Postals. But chances are, you talk to a battlefield guide up at Gettysburg, he's going to refer to him as James Park Postals. So for the purposes of our discussion tonight, I'll refer to this Delaware soldier as Postals. George Alfred Townsend was a newspaper correspondent during the Civil War. He was born in Georgetown. The wooden frame house of his birthplace was torn down in 1885, or near that time. The state of Delaware has erected a marker near the site of the birthplace. It's just off the Georgetown Circle, near where the Brick Hotel and Restaurant is located today. He was with George B. McClellan on the Peninsula Campaign, the spring of 1862, and what was called the 7 Days Battles. And he was with John Fitzgerald Pope's Union Army of Virginia at the Battle of Cedar Mountain. on August 9th, 1862, and he was the only experienced war correspondent who was with Phil Sheridan's forces at the Battle of Five Forks. Battle of Five Forks, very important. I consider it the Waterloo of the Confederacy because Lee was forced to evacuate Petersburg. And he was actually with Sheridan's forces when they marched into Richmond the following day, April 2nd. And he was a very descriptive writer. And in one account, he graphically described an amputation in the field. I shall not forget the bare-armed surgeons with bloody instruments that leaned over the rigid and insensible figure while the comrades of the subject looked horrified at the scene. He loved the Eastern Shore and is well known for a couple classics, Tales of the Chesapeake and this book, The Entailed Hat. It was published in the year, first published in the year 1884. Okay, Dr. Townsend. On January 27th, 1862, a bill was introduced in the United States Congress to authorize the recruitment of 150,000, quote, colored volunteers, unquote, for federal service. On October 26, 1863, that recruitment was extended to the state of Delaware, and recruiting stations were formed in Smyrna, Georgetown, and Wilmington. Delaware Secretary of State at the time, Nathaniel Smithers, prevented any United States colored troop regiments from forming within the state of Delaware. So as a result, most, if not practically all of those African Americans who entered federal service, entered the federal army, joined regiments that were formed in Pennsylvania, and those being the 8th, 22nd, 24th, 25th, and 45th United States Colored Troops. Most, if not all of these, practically, trained at Camp William Penn. It was open from the years 1863 till 1864, and at that time, 1863 to 1865, I'm sorry. And at that time, it was dismantled. There isn't much there today. I think there's a small monument, and the state of Pennsylvania has erected a historical marker. There were approximately 854 African Americans from Delaware that entered federal service in the Army. In Delaware, a slaveholder could sell an able-bodied male slave to the United States government to avoid the 1863 Draft Act for either himself or a member of his family. Until January of 1865, Jacob Charles Lingo was a slave that worked on a Sussex County farm in Broadkill Hundred. His owner, Cord Warrington, sold Jacob Charles Lingo to the United States government for the sum of $300, and it was that time that Lingo entered the 25th Regiment United States Colored Troops. Upon his release from federal service in the year 1867, after paying for his uniform and his accoutrements, he owed the United States government $300. I know it seems absurd by today's standards, but these were very peculiar times, especially in border states that were loyal to the Union but still advocated slavery. The photograph to the right, this photograph, I hope this thing's working, could possibly be the only photograph, and I say possibly, because there's always new information coming up, be the only photograph we have today of a Delaware slave. The child that's sitting in her lap was Hannah Stokely. Her grandfather owned a large farm over in Broadkill Hundred, Sussex County, with approximately 15 slaves that worked that farm. Her father was Charles Stokely. He would go on to become the 47th governor of Delaware. He had served from the years 1883 until 1887. Slaves in Delaware by the year 1861 represented less than 2% of the population. What I have in the table listed here is a breakdown of the population in Delaware in the year 1860, and these figures came directly from the state archives up in Dover. As you can see, the majority of slaves at that time resided in Sussex County. But it would be safe to say that if slavery had ended in Delaware at the time this census was taken, it would have had no significant economic impact on the state whatsoever. But it was a very hot political issue for that period. We're going to talk about James Park Hostels. At the time, the Union 2nd Brigade of Major General Alexander Hayes' 3rd Division arrived at the Gettysburg battlefield approximately 4 a.m. in the morning on July 2nd, 1863. Captain James Park Hostels, the 1st Delaware Regiment, was acting as the brigade's Assistant Inspector General. Beginning on July the 2nd until almost July the 3rd, the two opposing armies had been fighting for the possession of two farm buildings that dominated a 60-acre Gettysburg farm known as the Bliss Farm. It was located approximately 700 yards from the Union-held line here on Cemetery Ridge, in a virtual no man's land. It was coveted by both armies as being strategically important. It could provide cover for sharpshooters, or it could work as a forward observation post. The property owners, William and Adeline Bliss, along with their two daughters, Sarah and Frances, had wisely evacuated that property on the first day of the battle, July 1st. By almost noon of July 3rd, several companies of the Union 14th Connecticut Regiment had managed to capture and hold one of those buildings, the Bliss Barn. But only 40 to 60 yards away, the two-story white farmhouse was held by Confederate sharpshooters from Carnot Posey's Mississippi Brigade that had moved over from Seminary Ridge. And the fighting continued back and forth for the possession of both buildings. Well, back here at a place called Ziegler's Grove, Major General Alexander Hayes had it. with trying to gain possession of these buildings. It simply wasn't worth the trouble. So he sends an order down to his 2nd Brigade commander, Colonel Thomas Alfred Smythe. He was an Irish immigrant, moved to Wilmington, decided he liked it, joined the Federal Army. And that order was, Colonel, you will take that damn white farmhouse at all hazards. And I'm quoting his exact words or something to that effect. Well, the Union High Command had made a decision that those 14th Connecticut soldiers that now occupied the barn would be the ones to carry out this order. But there were no two-way radios, and the only way that order could be delivered would be by courier, either on foot or on horseback. Captain Thomas Alfred Smythe is standing pretty much where the First Delaware Monument is located today on the Gettysburg battlefield with his staff members. He turns to them and says, "Gentlemen, who will take that order?" Well, Captain James Park Hostels wasn't feeling very good that day, but he speaks up and says, "I will take it, sir." Fully cognizant of this dangerous mission that's ahead of him, Hostels mounts his war horse. Over here from Cemetery Ridge, he proceeds west towards the Bliss Farm property. As he crosses the Emmitsburg Road, he begins to encounter small arms fire from those Confederate sharpshooters in the 2-story white farmhouse and the surrounding orchard. He realizes, according to his account, that if he can keep his horse in motion, he just might live through this ordeal. So he digs the spurs into the side of his horse, and he's quoted later as in his memoirs, "The poor brute, his sides torn up by my spurs and his mouth lacerated and bleeding from the cruel curved bit, reared and kicked and plunged so that I was as bad a mark as though in full gallop. Upon reaching the Union-occupied barn with bullets whizzing around him and still keeping his horse in motion, he yells out Colonel Smythe's order to take the 2-story white farmhouse. Hostels recalled later that I wheeled my horse about, dug my spurs into my horse's side, loosened up on the reins, and it took off as if it was shot from a gun or something to that effect. He comes back to the Union lines on Cemetery Ridge, and observing this is Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, General 2nd Corps commander, and he acknowledges Hostels' deed of valor on July 3rd, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg. In a gallant charge, the soldiers from the 14th Connecticut evacuate the barn and are able to run the Confederate sharpshooters out of the 2-story white farmhouse. There were about 40 prisoners taken. After the dead and wounded were removed, both buildings were burned to the ground, along with all the Bliss family's possessions. Well, 29 years, 20 days later, James Park Hostels is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by the United States government for his deed of valor at the Battle of Gettysburg. And what happened to the Bliss family? Well, in the year 1902, the youngest daughter, Frances, was able to get a bill through the United States Congress for compensation on a destruction of property claim previously made by her father, William. But that bill was vetoed by then President Teddy Roosevelt, the old Rough Rider himself, and the Bliss family lost everything. As a matter of fact, they moved back to New York. If you visit the Gettysburg National Battlefield today and you get the tour of the Bliss Farm property, this is what it looks like. It's the lower picture in the slide. Okay. On April 19th, 1861, Fort Delaware, located on Pea Patch Island off Delaware City, was garrisoned with 175 federal troops. It would remain garrisoned throughout the war. Fort Delaware became a prisoner of war camp, housing captured Confederates, convicted federal soldiers, local political dissidents, and privateers. Some of the Delaware Confederates that were captured at the Battle of Gettysburg would return back to their home state as prisoners at Fort Delaware, and that's validated through the records at Fort Delaware. One of these prisoners was once a young naval officer from Brooklyn. His name was Samuel Wild Hardage, who became romantically involved with one of the most notorious Confederate female spies of the Civil War, Marie Isabel Boyd, commonly referred to as Belle Boyd, sometimes the Siren of the Shenandoah. Belle Boyd was born in Martinsburg, Virginia. Martinsburg would later become part of West Virginia in the year 1863. And she grew up to be a well-educated young lady. She had a formal education at the Mount Washington Female College in Baltimore. But from the time she was 17 years of age until the time she was 21, she had been arrested 6 times, imprisoned twice, and reported over 30 times for her activity as a Confederate spy. But she had the uncanny ability to flirt and cajole her way in and out of some of the most difficult situations. After release from her second imprisonment, she went south to Wilmington, North Carolina, and boarded a 3-masted cotton bale transport ship named the Greyhound. Under an alias, Mrs. Lewis, she carried on her person secret Confederate dispatches to be distributed to her contacts in Europe. Well, the Greyhound is out to sea about one day when it's spotted by the United States naval ship, the USS Connecticut, and the Connecticut gives pursuit and easily overtakes the slower cotton bale transport ship. Just before federal sailors board the Greyhound, Belle Boyd is able to recover her secret dispatches and ensure that they were destroyed. The captain of the United States naval ship Connecticut appoints a young federal officer, a lieutenant, named Samuel Wild Hardage, to take command of the captured ship and follow the Connecticut back to Hampton Roads at Fortress Monroe. Well, allegedly, Belle Boyd and this young officer were immediately attracted to one another. Belle Boyd records in her memoirs her first encounter with Samuel Wild Hardage. His every movement was so much that of a refined gentleman that my southern proclivities, strong as they were, yielded for a moment to the impulses of my heart. Isn't that eloquently written? Before they reached Fortress Monroe, Sam had asked Belle to marry him, and she agreed. After the two worked together to assist with the escape of the blockade runner's captain, George Beer. Well, when they reached Fortress Monroe and the federal authorities see that the blockade runners' captain's missing and these two are acting rather strangely, they're both arrested. Samuel Wallen Hardinge will be dismissed from the Navy. He'll lose his commission. And Belle Boyd is destined to go back to prison, but she escapes. She makes her way up to Canada. The federal agents are in pursuit. She realizes she's not safe in Canada, so she boards a sailing ship and goes to England, London. Samuel Hardinge later joins her there, and the two are married. It's at one point that Hardinge decides he's going to return to the United States. And according to the records at Fort Delaware, this is validated through the records, he was captured at Monocacy Station by federal agents. That's near Frederick. Probably most of you know that. And sent to Fort Delaware as a prisoner. And he was released from Fort Delaware late. It was in February of 1865. We don't know a whole lot about what happened to Samuel Hardinge after he was released from Fort Delaware. One account is that he succumbed to ailments he contacted in prison and died. Another account is that he may have gone to California. But Belle Boyd remained in England until after the war. She was pardoned. She returned to the United States. She was married twice more. She had 4 children. She was up in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin, giving a lecture when she suffered a heart attack and died in Wisconsin, very far from her Martinsburg, Virginia home. She's interred in the Spring Grove Cemetery at Wisconsin Dells. One account I read was that the pallbearers at her funeral were Union soldiers. I was surprised she didn't turn over in her casket after that. But an unidentified Southerner later came and placed a tombstone at her gravesite, and it read the following: Belle Boyd, Confederate spy, born in Virginia, died in Wisconsin, erected by a comrade. She may not have been the most notorious of the female Confederate spies, maybe such as Rose O'Neal Greenhow, but there's no question she was certainly the most colorful. There were approximately 50 to 2,000 men from Delaware of all colors that served in the Confederate Army and Navy. They mostly served in the Eastern Theater of Operations, but some, such as George Julian Robinson, we mentioned earlier, served in the West as well. One of these Delaware Confederates was John Dunning of Dover. Dunning was an ardent Democrat, a Southern sympathizer. He had a business over near Chesapeake City, Maryland. And for this, he was sent to prison at Fort McHenry for a period of about 4 to 6 months. He was released a very bitter young man. So he goes south to join up in the Confederacy. It's about that time that Captain John Singleton Mosby, who formerly rode with Jeb Stuart, was putting together a group of special operatives for missions behind Union lines. And John Dunning joined on as one of the first 25. Dunning was involved in what was called the 1864 Retaliatory Executions in the Shenandoah Valley. On September 23rd, 1864, one of Mosby's company commanders, Captain Samuel Chapman, he was sometimes referred to as the fighting parson of the 43rd Virginia Battalion, split his column of 123 Rangers and attacked a Union supply train, wagon train, near Front Royal, Virginia. But what the Confederates didn't realize was that it was being escorted by a full brigade of regular United States cavalry, and there was a fight. Chapman was just barely able to get his company out of there. They just barely were able to escape, except for 6 of those that were captured. During the fight, a young federal officer, a Lieutenant Charles McMasters, was shot by one of Mosby's men. And the Federals alleged that he was shot after he surrendered. So the Union High Command thought they would teach Mosby a lesson. So in an act of revenge, they took the 6 prisoners. 3 were shot in the head immediately. 2 were hung. The other one that was shot was a young 17-year-old boy. He wasn't even a Ranger at all. He had joined in with the Rangers on their escape. But a Federal soldier placed a gun to his head and pulled the trigger while his mother stood nearby and begged for his son's life. And this was the level of brutality that we would see in the Shenandoah Valley by 1864 and elsewhere. A note was pinned to the clothing of one of the 2 prisoners that were hung in the execution, and it read, "Such is the fate of Mosby's men." Well, when Mosby heard about this, he was outraged. He sends a letter to General Robert E. Lee asking for permission to execute 7 Federal prisoners in retaliation. And General Lee, learning of the circumstances, agrees. It was at this location, the slide to the left, the bottom, where 27 Federal prisoners were led by Mosby's men. In a brown felt hat were placed 27 scraps of paper. 7 of those scraps were marked, and the Federal prisoners that drew those 7 marked scraps of paper were the ones destined for execution. However, the ones that drew the paper were not necessarily the ones that were executed. There's quite a lot to this story, as you can well imagine. The one leading the detail for John Singleton Mosby was a Lieutenant Ed Thompson. He was to take the prisoners near the Union lines at Front Royal and ensure that they were executed. Another member of that detail was John Dunning of Dover, Delaware. The following morning, pinned to the body of one of the executed Federal prisoners was a note that read, "These men have been hung in retaliation for an equal number of Mosby's men, hung by order of General Custer at Front Royal. Measure for measure." John Dunning served with the 43rd Virginia Cavalry until they were disbanded. They never surrendered. Disbanded at this site. It's at Marshall, Virginia. During the war, it was called Salem, Virginia, and there is a historical marker near the site of the where Mosby was quoted as saying, "I have summoned you together for the last time." Surrounded by tidal marshes and tall grass, located 6 miles northwest of Salem, New Jersey, is Finns Point National Cemetery. Among a picturesque setting, the 85-foot concrete and granite obelisk silently guards the final resting place of those, not all, who died at Fort Delaware. A haunting reminder of the Civil War's human cost. Now recent estimates place the casualty toll between 650 and 850,000. In addition, an estimated 1.5 million horses and mules were either killed or died from disease during the course of the war. A monument located at the National Sporting Museum or Library in Middleburg, Virginia, stands today honoring their service. Patsy.
Theodore O'Hara attained the rank of brevet major in the Mexican War and later colonel in the 12th Alabama Infantry. He is probably best remembered as author of a poem written after the Battle of Buena Vista in 1847, each verse a testimony to those who gave their last full measure. Standing since 1885, at Finns Point National Cemetery are 7 iron plates. Each plate contains 1 quatrant of O'Hara's poem entitled Bivouac of the Dead. Rest on embalmed and sainted dead, dear's the blood ye gave. No impious footstep here shall tread, no herbage of your grave. On fame's eternal camping ground, their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead. No rumor of the foe's advance now sweeps upon the wind, no troubled thought at midnight haunts of loved ones left behind. No vision of the morrow strife, the warrior's dream alarms, no braying horn nor screaming fife at dawn shall call to arms. The neighing troop, the flashing blade, the bugle-stirring blast, the charge, the dreadful cannonade, the din and shout are past. Your own proud land's heroic soil must be your fitter grave. She claims from war his richest spoil, the ashes of the brave. The muffled drum's sad roll has beat the soldier's last tattoo. No more on life's parade shall meet that brave and fallen few.